It was still dark when the firing started. Not scattered shots, not the slow, measured cracks of rifles taking turns. This was something else. German soldiers pressed into the earth and listened. The sound came fast, too fast, rolling across the hedgerows in overlapping bursts. 8, 10, then more. It echoed, merged, became a single continuous roar. They shouted warnings down the line. A company was advancing, maybe more. Machine guns, they thought, or an entire infantry battalion closing in. But when flares went up, there was no massed formation, no waves of men, just a handful of Americans moving through the dark, wet uniforms, scattered, alone. And still the fire did not slow. Every few seconds the rhythm reset, then surged again, relentless, controlled, impossibly steady. To the men on the receiving end, it made no sense. This much fire was not supposed to come from so few rifles. That confusion mattered. Because on a battlefield, sound shapes decisions. It tells you when to advance, when to dig in, when to break and run. And on nights like this, German units were making those decisions based on a lie carried on the sound of American rifle fire, a sound that made a platoon feel like a company, and a company feel like an army. German infantry were trained to read a battlefield by sound. They had to. Smoke, darkness, and terrain often hid everything else. A bolt-action rifle spoke in a familiar rhythm. Crack, pause, crack again. That pause mattered. It told you how many men were firing. It told you how fast they could reload. It told you how long you had to move before the next shot came. For decades, European armies had built tactics around that rhythm. One rifleman fired while another worked his bolt. Fire came in turns, predictable, measured, survivable. Machine guns were different. They had a voice no one confused for anything else, a ripping, continuous roar that meant one thing: stay down or die. American rifle fire. American. Didn't fit either category. It wasn't the steady crack of bolt-action rifles, and it wasn't quite the scream of a machine gun. It sat somewhere in between, fast, sustained, overlapping. To German ears, it broke the rules. A single American soldier could fire again and again without lifting his hand from the trigger. No pause to work a bolt, no break in the rhythm. Multiply that by 8 or 10 men in a squad, and the numbers changed fast. What should have been 15 shots a minute became 40. What should have been gaps became pressure. What should have been maneuver time vanished. German reports kept using the same language. Unexpected volume of fire. Automatic weapons suspected. Enemy strength misjudged. They weren't misjudging courage or skill. They were misjudging mathematics. On a battlefield, fear grows from simple calculations. How many rifles are firing? How long before they reload? How much ground can I cross before the next burst? Against American units, those calculations kept coming out wrong. And when math fails under fire, fear fills the gap. The problem wasn't accuracy. American soldiers could shoot straight. They always had. From the forests of the Revolutionary War to the trenches of the First World War, marksmanship had never been the weakness. The weakness was time. A bolt-action rifle forced every rifleman into the same ritual. Fire, lift the hand, unlock the bolt, pull it back, push it forward, lock it, find the target again. On a calm range, a well-trained soldier could make that dance look effortless. 15 aimed shots a minute, maybe 20 on a good day. Combat erased that perfection. Hands shook, mud crept into actions, fear shortened breaths and slowed fingers. Under fire, the practical rate dropped fast, sometimes to half of what training promised. Meanwhile, the battlefield itself was changing. The First World War had proven that machine guns ruled open ground. They could stop entire battalions, but only if they were in place. They were heavy. They were crew-served. They defended ground far better than they could take it. Infantry still had to move forward, and forward movement still depended on the riflemen. Every army understood the dilemma. They tried different answers. The Germans issued submachine guns for close combat, deadly at short range but limited beyond it. The British trained their men to cycle bolt so fast that enemies mistook it for automatic fire. Others experimented with early automatic rifles, heavy, fragile, or unreliable. None of it solved the central problem. How do you give every infantryman more firepower without turning him into a machine gun crew, without drowning him in ammunition, without sacrificing accuracy or reliability? For decades, no one found the answer. And then the next war began approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit, with armies still carrying rifles designed for a different century. The answer did not come from doctrine. It did not come from generals or battlefield theorists. It came from a quiet engineer who measured time the way other men measured distance. John Cantius Garand was born in 1888 on a small farm in Quebec. He was one of 12 children. When his mother died, his childhood ended early. His family crossed into the United States looking for work, not opportunity. Garand grew up in factory towns, among machines, belts, gears, and steel. He never attended college. He never studied engineering in a classroom. He learned by watching. By the time he was a teenager, he was working long hours in textile mills, then machine shops, surrounded by moving parts that punished mistakes without mercy. If something failed, it did not fail politely. It shattered, it jammed, it injured. Garand learned to hate wasted motion. Every unnecessary movement was friction. Every delay was inefficiency. Every failure had a cause, if you were patient enough to find it. When he began studying firearms, he didn't think about them as weapons first. He thought about them as systems. Energy in, work done, energy out. He watched bolts cycle. He timed springs. He counted fractions of seconds between shots. Other designers chased power or novelty. Garand chased reliability measured over time. Not how a rifle worked once, but how it worked after 10,000 rounds, in dirt, in cold, in the hands of exhausted men. In 1919, the U.S. Army brought him to Springfield Armory. His task sounded simple: replace the bolt-action rifle. In reality, it meant solving a problem no one else had cracked. How to save time without sacrificing control. How to speed fire without losing accuracy. How to build a machine that would keep working when soldiers were tired, scared, and wet. Garand did not rush. He worked the way he always had, quietly, methodically, stopwatch in hand, shaving seconds from the act of killing, one movement at a time. Garand did not invent his rifle in a flash of inspiration. He built it the slow way, failure by failure. Early designs looked promising on paper, then collapsed under dirt, heat, and repeated firing. Recoil systems were too delicate. Gas systems fouled themselves into uselessness. Parts cracked, springs snapped, operating rods bent. Every problem sent him back to the bench. Garand became obsessed with balance. Too much gas and the rifle tore itself apart. Too little and it failed to cycle. The timing had to be exact, not once, but every time. He tested thousands of rounds, then tens of thousands more. He moved gas ports by millimeters, changed angles no one else thought mattered, rebuilt components that soldiers would eventually drop, strike, and neglect. Years passed. Other designers came and went. Budgets shrank, interest faded. But Garand kept refining the same idea, a self-loading rifle that worked not when conditions were perfect, but when they were worst. The breakthrough wasn't spectacular. It was practical. 8 rounds held together in a simple metal clip. No detachable magazine to lose. No complex feeding system to jam sideways. Just cartridges pressed straight down into the rifle. When the last round fired, the empty clip was thrown clear. The bolt locked open. The rifle told the soldier, without words, that it was time to reload. It was not elegant. It was not silent. But it was fast. By the early 1930s, after 17 years of testing and revision, the rifle finally did what the Army had demanded all along. It loaded itself, it fired reliably, and it kept firing. When the United States adopted it in 1936, the rifle was already old by design standards, but it had been aged deliberately, broken, fixed, broken again, until there was very little left that could fail. What soldiers would soon carry into battle was not a prototype. It was 17 years of mistakes, compressed into 8 rounds. On paper, the change looked modest. 1 trigger pull still fired. 1 round. But on the battlefield, it rewrote everything. With a bolt-action rifle, a soldier fought in bursts of effort and pause. Fire. Break contact with the weapon, work the bolt, Return to the sights. Every shot stole time. Every movement interrupted focus. The M1 Garand erased that interruption. A soldier could fire, recover from recoil, and fire again without breaking his sight picture. The rifle fed itself. The action closed itself. The next round was already waiting. In training, that meant speed. In combat, it meant survival. A well-trained rifleman with a bolt action might manage 15 aimed shots a minute under fire. With the Garand, that number climbed to 40, sometimes 50. Not spray, not panic fire. Aimed shots delivered as fast as the eye could find targets. That difference multiplied outward. A German squad expected a certain tempo from enemy rifles. Moments to move, moments to breathe, moments to maneuver. Those moments disappeared. 8 riflemen. With Garands could put out the same volume of fire as an entire company armed with older weapons, not continuously, but in waves so tight they felt unbroken. It changed how Americans fought. Fire teams could suppress without waiting for machine guns. Small units could fix enemy positions long enough to move. Momentum shifted downward, from heavy weapons to the individual soldier, and it changed how the enemy reacted. German infantry were trained to close distance during lulls in fire. Against the Garand, the lull never came. What the rifle really did was simple. It did not make men braver. It did not make them better shots. It gave them time. And then it took that time away from the enemy. In war, that exchange is everything. Normandy was not supposed to be a rifleman's fight. The plan depended on air power, artillery, armor, everything the Allies could bring to bear at once. But when American soldiers hit the ground, much of that vanished. Paratroopers landed scattered. Across flooded fields and hedgerows, units broke apart in the dark. Maps were useless. Radios were silent or lost. What remained were small groups of men, often no more than a squad, moving blind through country that favored the defender. The hedgerows were ancient, thick earth walls topped with roots and brush. They swallowed sound. They blocked vision. They turned every encounter into a sudden, close-range fight. Rifles were dragged through salt water, mud, and manure. Men fired from kneeling positions, from ditches, from behind trees and farm walls. There was no time for careful fire discipline, and the rifles kept working. Soldiers later remembered the same moment of realization. They squeezed the trigger once, then again, and again. The rifle did not ask them to stop and think. It stayed with them, shot after shot, as fast as they could see and react. German patrols probing American positions ran into something they did not expect. A hedgerow would erupt with fire, not a burst, not a pause, just pressure. German reports spoke of strong enemy forces holding positions that were, in reality, defended by a handful of men who had never trained together before that night. The Garand did not make the chaos go away. It did something more important. It gave scattered Americans the ability to act decisively before the enemy could understand what they were facing. In Normandy's tight, violent terrain, theory finally met reality. And reality favored the rifle that could keep firing when everything else had fallen apart. By the summer of 1944, German intelligence had a growing problem. The reports coming in from the front did not agree with one another, or with doctrine. After-action summaries described American units with firepower that didn't match their size. Patrols ran into what they believed were reinforced positions, only to discover too late that the resistance came from far fewer men than expected. The language repeated itself. Enemy. Strength misjudged. Automatic weapons suspected. Unusually high volume of rifle fire. Officers tried to make the pieces fit. They assumed hidden machine guns. They assumed overlapping units. They assumed deception. What they did not assume was that ordinary riflemen were producing that volume of fire on their own. German infantry doctrine was built around a clear hierarchy of sound. Rifles meant opportunity. Machine guns meant danger. Movement depended on knowing the difference. American fire blurred that distinction. A hedgerow or tree line would erupt with sustained rifle fire, pinning German squads in place. Men waited for the lull that always came with bolt-action rifles. It didn't come. The result was hesitation. Units delayed movement. Attacks stalled. Small American positions were treated as larger ones, buying time the defenders did not technically possess. Captured rifles confirmed the truth. The Americans were not using machine guns disguised as rifles. They were using rifles that simply fired faster than anything German soldiers were accustomed to facing. By the time this reality was fully understood, it was already too late to change it at scale. German reports finally named the weapon. A self-loading rifle. 8 rounds, fired as fast as a man could pull the trigger. What unsettled German commanders most was not the technology itself, it was the implication. If every American rifleman could sound like a machine gun, then American infantry no longer fought by familiar rules. And wars are rarely won by armies still fighting the last one. Germany did not ignore the problem. They tried to solve it. Long before Normandy, German engineers had understood the same equation the Americans were exploiting. More fire at the squad level meant more control of the battlefield. The answer, on paper, was obvious. A self-loading rifle of their own. The problem was everything else. The first attempts, the G41 rifles, were burdened by requirements that made sense to planners, not to soldiers. They were forbidden from drilling gas ports into barrels. Designers were forced into complex systems that trapped gas at the muzzle, fouled quickly, and failed under dirt and cold. On the Eastern Front, soldiers abandoned them whenever they could. A slow, familiar bolt-action rifle was better than a fast one that stopped working. Later, designs improved. The G43 was lighter, simpler, and closer to what German infantry actually needed. But by then, Germany was fighting the wrong war at the wrong time. Factories were under constant bombing. Steel was scarce. Skilled workers were at the front or dead. Only a fraction of German infantry ever received a semi-automatic rifle. Most went into battle in 1944 and 1945 with the same bolt-action rifles their fathers had carried in 1918. Germany did produce a revolutionary answer, the Sturmgewehr, an entirely new concept, automatic fire, intermediate ammunition, unmatched close-range power. But it arrived too late, and in numbers too small. The American advantage was not brilliance during the war, it was preparation before it. The United States had solved the problem in peacetime, with factories intact and choices still available. Germany tried to solve it while losing ground, losing industry, and losing time. By the time German infantry understood what American rifle fire really meant, they were already fighting against an enemy whose advantage could no longer be erased. Catching up is hard. Catching up under fire is almost impossible. There were moments in the war when American advantages disappeared. Artillery could not be brought forward. Aircraft were grounded by weather. Tanks were lost, bogged down, or simply not there when needed. What remained was the infantrymen. In forests, in snow, in shattered villages and narrow lanes, battles collapsed inward. Ranges shortened, visibility vanished, orders dissolved into instinct. This was where the war reverted to its oldest form. Men advancing, men defending, rifles deciding who lived long enough to move again. In the Hürtgen forest, sound died among the trees. Shells burst unseen, units lost direction within minutes. Here, firepower mattered more than maneuver. In the Ardennes, winter froze weapons solid. Lubricants thickened, fingers numbed, bolt handles became liabilities, not tools. And still, the Garand kept cycling, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but reliably enough to matter. American soldiers learned they could trust it when nothing else could be trusted, when visibility was measured in yards, when reinforcements were hours away, when retreat was impossible. A German counterattack might emerge suddenly through fog or trees. There was no time to coordinate machine guns, no time to wait for mortars. The response came from the line itself. Rifles opened fire, fast, controlled, overlapping. The sound surged forward before the men did. It stopped. Attacks long enough for Americans to reposition, to breathe, to survive. In these moments, the Garand was not impressive. It was decisive. Not because it was advanced, but because it worked when complexity failed. When everything else fell away, plans, formations, supporting arms, the outcome rested on what each man could do with the rifle in his hands. And in that narrow, brutal space, the American rifleman was no longer outpaced. He was finally equal to the moment. George S. Patton was not known for understatement. When he praised something, it was because it had proven itself in blood. He called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, not the most elegant, not the most advanced, the greatest. Patton was not talking about steel or mechanisms, he was talking about effect. The Garand did not win battles by itself. Artillery still shattered defenses, tanks still broke through, aircraft still decided campaigns. But when all of that paused or failed, the rifle remained. It stayed in the hands of men who were cold, exhausted, and afraid. Men who did not think in terms of doctrine or engineering, men who needed their weapon to fire when they pulled the trigger. The Garand gave them confidence, not bravado, but certainty. The certainty that they could answer fire with fire, that they could hold ground long enough for help to arrive, that they would not be silenced by the mechanics of their own weapon. Patton understood something simple. Wars are not decided only by grand maneuvers or brilliant plans. They are decided by moments when everything narrows, to a hedgerow, to a tree line, to a few frightened men and the rifles they carry. In those moments, the Garand mattered, not because it was perfect, but because it worked. And for the men who carried it, that was enough. After the war, armies studied what had happened, not just who had won, but why. They counted tanks destroyed. They measured bomb tonnage. They analyzed campaigns and commanders. But at the infantry level, the conclusion was unavoidable. The bolt-action rifle was finished. It had served for decades. It was accurate. It was durable. But it demanded time, and the modern battlefield no longer gave any. What the M1 Garand proved was not merely that semi-automatic fire was possible. It proved that it was necessary. Future rifles would change shape. They would shrink calibers. They would adopt magazines instead of clips. They would fire in bursts or full automatic. But none of that erased the lesson learned between hedgerows, forests, and frozen roads. Firepower at the level of the individual soldier was no longer optional. It was decisive. The sound that once fooled German patrols, that rolling, relentless pressure, became the new normal of infantry combat, and with it, an era quietly ended, not with a declaration, not with a final shot, but with the realization that the old rhythm, fire, pause, fire again, had no place in the wars to come.